All right, so we'll take maybe just the next 10 or 15 minutes here to close out this lecture by turning attention here, like where we left off, talking about the Dutch efforts to facilitate settlement around the world, largely along commercial lines. Just in the last segment, we were talking about the Dutch East India Company, this very kind of mercantilist type of organization where you have the Dutch Republic, the government, working in close association with the company itself, the private interests, the private sector, in order to enhance and promote settlement in these colonial areas under their jurisdiction, but also to drive the growth of national wealth itself. When you begin to have investors put up cash, put up money in order to sponsor a company or to get them off the ground and operating, um, the more that you the wider pool, the wider net you cast in order to have an to attract investors. This means that you are diluting risk because there are more people that might contribute a part of their funds, part of their savings or earnings into the company itself, um, so that the risk to themselves is not as great as it would be if a few investors were going all in order to uh, get the company going. So the Dutch government here, understanding this, argued that there should be that interest in the company should be divided between all Dutch cities and provinces. And the government asked Dutch citizens to invest within this company in order to help promote its success and to, again, dilute risk. By 1606, those individuals who had invested money were often provided with certificates, basically documentation that they owned X amount of the company itself. Of course, these are the first shareholders. Um, they were provided with paper shares known as an action. This is where we get the idiom, a piece of the action, because these individuals had a piece of the broader Dutch East India Company itself. This would create opportunities where we see a number of firsts, you might say, within the kind of a more modern economic system, largely because of the Dutch imagination here in their Dutch East India Company. To begin with, this company became the world's first multinational company. That they had warehouses, offices, officers, officials, all stationed all around the world where Dutch interests were at stake. And because this was a monopoly, shareholders were virtually guaranteed profits. Over the company's lifetime, it paid a 16.5% dividend per year, which even in modern terms is quite excellent. That whatever you invest, you are almost guaranteed a 16.5% return on that initial investment per year. It's you're not going to find that kind of growth for such a long period of time spread across such a broad kind of segment of society too often. What's also interesting here is that shares were set by supply and demand. Company policy made it so that shares would not be bought back by the company if there were individuals who wished to sell their actions or their stock or their interests within the company itself. If you wanted to sell your um, share of the company, then you had to do so. You had to find a willing buyer, another individual, in which to you know serve as the counterpart in that transaction. This gives birth to the world's first true stock exchange. because the place in which this happened, the place that people went to in order to sell or buy and exchange their certificates, their actions, occurred outside the main offices in Amsterdam of the Dutch East India Company itself. And so that was the world's first stock exchange, kind of in the plaza outside the main office buildings there. And it should be noted that the Dutch East India Company was, I mean, incredibly wealthy. They bought their own ships. They had their own military. They had their own navy, their own fleet that oversaw the protection of their trade routes and the protection of the movement and shipments of goods from any types of competing authorities on the high seas from fellow European powers. And so as a result, this was the breadth and extent of influence and authority that this company had was quite dominant, but also in many respects quite inspirational as well. And as mentioned, towards the tail end of of the last segment here, they are basically overseeing and profiting from virtually all trade occurring in the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. And I should say, all trade occurring along and with Dutch shipping, but also Dutch markets, Dutch buyers and sellers. Closer to home, with regard to settlement in North America, you had the likes of Henry Hudson, an English sea captain, um, who um, was employed by the Dutch to lead an expedition in 1609 that was largely interested in exploring what is today New York, state of New York. He would sail up a river later called the Hudson River, and he was backed by wealthy Dutch merchants eager to profit from the rich fur trade that they hoped to begin to tap into and exploit. By the 1620s, private investors, Dutch investors primarily, had established settlements and trading posts in what is today Delaware, Connecticut, and New York State. Areas such as New York City and Albany are originally Dutch settlements. In 1626, Dutch merchants bought the entire island of Manhattan, some 22,000 acres of land, for about $24 worth of trading goods. Of course, now that's some of the most profitable property in all the world. But it gives you, in essence, an example of the how cheap land was, because again, it was so abundant. So New York City itself was not New York City. It was originally Amsterdam. It was a Dutch settlement before it was an English settlement. Now, what's going to happen is that you have English, Dutch, French, German settlements beginning to be sprinkled all along the eastern seaboard in many cases. And as imperial rivalries are going to play themselves out in Europe, then this would result in conflict. And in some cases, war would overflow into the New World and the communities in the New World itself. And so, as we move forward, especially when we get into the 17th century, England and the Netherlands would go to war. Uh, that would pit New Amsterdam against other English settlements like Massachusetts or Philadelphia. And when those wars came to a conclusion, it was in the English interest, and over time, the English are going to assume control over the Dutch populations that were along the eastern seaboard of what is later becomes the United States. So there is a multicultural, um, uh, almost multi national type of uh, experience that the English are beginning to increasingly take control of along the eastern seaboard itself. By 1640, however, the Dutch trading companies themselves allowed settlers to begin to trade freely with Native Americans. And also, wealthy speculators began to release their monopoly on trading rights. Again, previously, settlers could only sell their goods to the trading company itself. This was they began to renege or kind of reverse that policy again in order to attract additional settlers to those specific settlements, specifically the Dutch settlements. So it was these competing commercial interests along the Atlantic coastline meant that they had to appeal to the settlers' interests, and this gives settlers a certain degree of leverage that they can, you know, bank on in order to, you know, determine where it is they're actually going to settle um, in this part of the New World. Trading companies also provided settlers with tax exempt status for a certain period of time, as much as 8 years in some cases. This allowed colonists to, again, get their homesteads up and running, to enjoy profits, tax free profits for a number of years that they could then plow back into their homesteads to, buy the material or, kind of build the homes that they need to or reinvest into the homestead itself. Um, so that type of tax incentive could also serve as an effort to kind of attract and promote a certain part of the New World over another. With regard to the Dutch and their relations with Native Americans, they saw Indians, Native Americans, the Iroquois in particular, as valuable trading allies and kept relatively peaceful relations with them, something that the English admired and tried, and even after the English assumed control over Dutch settlements and the Dutch people themselves living in those settlements, the English tried as best they could to maintain um, those types of good relations. It did not last, but um, it was the English were always kind of struggling with trying to cultivate good relations with the native populations. So again, here in summation, you can see just how varied the colonial process and strategies were with regard to the motives of settlement. Um, uh, that you have even within the English experience, state-backed efforts through things like Roanoke, commercial private interests through things like the Virginia companies, religious freedom with regard to the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and even the Maryland colony itself, or as payment, political payment for loyalty, such as in the case of, again, Maryland, but also specifically in the Carolinas themselves. And also, you can see this out, kind of um, between various European experiences. In Florida, with the Spanish settlement in St. Augustine, on the Great Lakes in the Ohio Valley and Mississippi Valley, with the French presence in the middle colonies, and again, specifically New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, with Dutch interests being kind of organizing themselves. And then also with regard to trying to incentivize um, prospective settlers to come to certain communities over others. In the case again, as just mentioned with the Dutch, offering tax incentives, free trading rights, um, and things of that nature. So, because of this, Europeans were really kind of bending over backwards in many cases in order to try and encourage New World settlement by almost any means necessary. What we're going to do is in the next lecture is to refocus attention not on the macro scale, which is what we just covered, but more on a micro scale as far as the individual experiences and the varied experiences of the colonies and the colonists themselves and their day-to-day life. So that's what we'll turn to next time.